Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host, and also the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to highlight relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts and practitioners. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Daren Martin, who advises, speaks, and writes books on company culture, employee engagement, sales leadership, customer experience, and much more. His best-selling book, A Company of Owners, has sparked positive change at companies around the world and has been called the best book I've read since Good to Great by Jim Collins. Other titles that he's authored include Whiteboard, Business Models that Inspire Action, Unbeach Your Company, Learning to Swim in the New Ocean, and The Sink, Radical Transformation with One Small Change. Daren's thought leadership and change strategies in transforming companies have earned him the title of Culture Architect. Thank you for joining me today, Daren.
Hey, Charles, I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. Well, let's to start it off. I love how you open your book with a question that you ask senior leader executives, right, in large corporations, of how many of them would say they work in a predominantly owner culture company. Now, I already know the answer to this, but I'd love to hear what those results were.
Yeah, I mean, it borders on ridiculous. And I actually ask a series of questions. What's the average engagement at your company per when I'm doing a keynote? And I'll get anywhere from 15% to 2%. Had somebody say 1% one time. I thought, well, that better be you if 99% of your people are not engaged. But I think a company of owners is something that when they just hear that term, executives sort of salivate over, because that's not the experience in many cases. And all of the data backs up that that's not the experience. So it's obviously an issue. The idea actually came about with a conversation with the COO of a $20 billion company in the hallway. And I said, hey, Dave, you need to fire your employees. And he said, what are you talking about there? And I can't fire all my employees. I said, yep, you don't want employees. You want people who act like owners. And boy, you could see the little light bulb come up over his head. And so that turned into a talk, which turned into a book. And it has been a very popular topic among leadership and executives all over the world.
Well, tell me a little bit more about an owner culture company. What are some of the characteristics? What defines that kind of company?
Well, a couple ways to put it. It's the difference between owning something and renting something. How most people treat a rental car. But I think the basic breakdown comes that years and years ago, we reduced work to one agreement. And that agreement was, you come to work, you do what I tell you, and I'll give you some money for it. And when that happened, largely with the Industrial Revolution, where we started punching clocks and performing just tasks that are pretty rote, et cetera, that we just kind of sucked the soul right out of workers and people. And there became this big disconnect between the company's agenda, the company's mission and all of that, and the individual folks. I mean, think about the way most people walk in or drag themselves in on a Monday morning and dance their way out on a Friday. It's very reflective of the fact that there is just this bifurcation that's happened between people really investing their all. Now, there's exceptions to that rule, because you've got companies like Patagonia, In-N-Out Burger, Ritz-Carlton, who have great cultures and people are really passionate about being a part of it. But that's the exception in my experience, not the rule.
And how do you build those kind of cultures? Because it's easier to see those cultures being existing, right? I mean, when you go to a Ritz, when you go to an In-N-Out to get a burger in, it's like, wow, that's the kind of company I want to work for. But how does a company bridge the gap? Because in your book, you say there's companies where you have zombie employees, where there's no engagement whatsoever. What would be a first step to get a company along the right path to be more owner culture directed?
So I call it the four C's. The first one is you got to call it by the right name. There's an old proverb says the beginning of wisdom is calling things by the right name. And in my experience, I'll talk to executives and they'll say, oh, we've got a great culture. And then when you talk to 100 people within the company, they all say, we have a horrible culture, right? So first of all, you got to recognize if there's a gap between what your stated culture is and what the hidden culture is. Here's what we say we do. Here's what's really going on. So you got to do what I say, get out of the suite and into the street and actually go out and start polling people, talking to people. What do we say and we do that we don't really do? What do we say we don't do that we actually do? And start assessing what's our current state, because you have to begin from there. And then you work on the second C, which is crafting it, where you start saying, okay, if you think the typical gap analysis, here's where we are, here's where we want to be. Now, what do we have to do to get to that place? And you start building this, because great cultures don't happen by default. Everybody's got a culture. Most of those are default cultures, but great cultures happen by design. So you actually sit down and map out, here's what we want to be known for. Here's what we want it to feel like walking into this place. So you design that. And then you have to cast it. Obviously, the old, you mentioned Jim Collins earlier, but get the right people on the bus. We talk about that a lot, but one of the things we don't talk about is who are the right people. And it's got to be a unique fit to whatever culture you're trying to create. If this is a creative agency, well, then obviously you want creative people. And I can go into more detail on that. But then the last thing is that you want to cultivate it. Culture is not a one-time event. And getting a company of owners is not a one-time event. Culture. My short answer a lot of times when and you're saying, well, Daren, why didn't you give me that? But when people say, executives ask me, well, how do we get people to act like owners? And the very short version of that is treat them like owners. So when they don't have a seat at the table, they're not asked about their ideas. I'll give you a prime example. Bumped into a friend the other day that was the top sales guy in the world for a very high-end men's clothing brand. I mean, very expensive stuff. And he was at a conference and he met the executives. Of course, they know who he is, top leading sales guy. And he said, hey, I've got some ideas that I think could really help us as a company and some things that kind of to take us to an even different level. What they said to him, Charles, eh,
I'm afraid to ask.
no thanks. We've got it. Yeah, yeah, we don't need to hear those. So guess what he did? He left the company. And went to YSL, by the way, Yves Saint Laurent. So, and guess what they did? Begged him to come back. And basically said, the fact that I would have to go to that level to get you to now be interested in listening, I don't want to be a part of this.
Too little, too late.
Yeah, too little, too late. Absolutely.
Well, I love the distinction that you draw, that employees feel entitled while owners feel empowered. And I think getting that empowerment to them through the dialogue, through the values that you preach and cultivating it. I love that 4C framework, because owners take care of the business as if it belongs to them. They have a vested interest. And that's so critical to any business, is to have that vested interest from all employees, whether it be frontline employees all the way to the top. But that's, like you said, that's easier said than done. And it needs to follow a framework. And if culture is not on purpose, right, the default culture is usually not the one that you want to promote.
Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah, and I was out on a morning walk a while back and I came across a guy cleaning a cement truck, which, by the way, concrete truck, which was spotless, not what you would expect to see in a concrete truck. So I went over to him and he's polishing the chrome and I said, hey, can I ask you a question? He goes, sure. And I said, is this your truck? He said, yeah. I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm cleaning my truck. And I said, okay, but why? He said, he looked up at me. I expected him, Charles, to say, well, because we're doing this big campaign and I can win a trip to Hawaii if I had the cleanest truck. Or, man, if my manager comes by and this truck isn't clean, I get in big trouble. He just looked at me and said, well, you got to take pride in your work, right? And I thought, oh my goodness. I looked this company up. It's a company out of Colombia. Guess what they have? A fantastic culture. And they've hardwired that sense of what I call leaving it better than you found it into everything that they do. Contrast that, 4 months later, I'm walking down the street and I see another concrete truck, which is caked in cement. It has oil dripping from it. The workers are standing around like, oh, I hate my job. I hate my life. And which of those companies do you think cuts corners? Which of those companies do you think takes better care of their employees? Which of those companies? I could go on and on. The answer is very clear because it's evident in the kind of picture that you're seeing.
Oh, that's great. That's a great example of, because you usually see that with companies with strong culture, those type of employees. Yeah. Yeah. You can't have a certain type of exceptional employee that takes pride regardless of the culture, but that's not the common practice. In your book, you go through an experiment with where you identify, or the researchers throw a piece of paper in the hallway of a busy office, right?
Yeah.
And you wanted to identify, right, the owner mentality, who has it and who doesn't. Can you elaborate on that experiment and how that really drives this point home?
Yeah, so you take a big hallway at a company, and you wad up a piece of paper and just throw it in the middle of the walkway, and then you watch what happens. You can imagine that typically passersby, they go by, and then finally somebody comes and they lean over and they pick it up and they throw it in the wastebasket. And then when you go interview that person and say, "Okay, why did you do that?" Their response is something like, "Well, this is my place. This is my home. This is, my workplace. We got to keep it looking good, right?" I used to do that at conferences. So I would throw wads of paper before I spoke big keynote thing. And one time we were at the Ritz Carlton, and the problem was all of the people taking care of us, serving the food and doing, were picking up the paper. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I need you to leave the paper wadded up on the ground. And they couldn't do it, Charles. It's so much in their DNA
Right.
that you could see them start to sweat and shake like, no, I cannot not pick it up. And it wasn't out of fear of being reprimanded. It was just they take such great pride in their workspace.
Oh, that's a great example. I mean, and that's a great way of identifying a company and the culture that's currently in place, to see how many of them have that owner mindset, right? In a simple task like the one just demonstrated, how it can indicate what their mindset is for the company overall. So it's trying to craft this culture that a company wants to have, and it needs to be deliberate. It can't be by default. And like you put in the book too with Kawasaki, he points that you really need a mantra, not a mission, because a lot of the culture is determined by the values that a company has and how they support those values. And I love that distinction that you give between a mantra and a mission, because a mantra really directs action, behavioral change, right? Whereas a mission is just a bunch of words that may not have the same kind of impact.
Yeah, I love that actually from Guy and expanded on it. But if you look at Enron's values, integrity, truthfulness, I mean, it's just so much gobbledygook, and that's what the typical mission statement is. We endeavor to create a value for our blah blah blah, right? And it's just throwaway words. You could take a mission statement or values off one company's walls, put it on another company wall, they wouldn't know any different. In fact,
Right.
I asked 500 executive assistants at a conference in Vegas. I said, "How many of y'all can recite your company's mission statement?" Only 4 hands went up out of 500 people. So it just doesn't work. And you probably have the right statistic, but this is close enough that what is it, like 77% of people say, employees say that we don't live our values at our company. We can say this all day long. So mantra is the exact opposite of that. Part of the greatness of the Ritz Carlton is their one of their mantras. I don't know if they call it that, but we are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. That is the best management tool ever. Hey, when you clean that room, were you living that? When you check those people in, were you treating them like ladies and gentlemen? Were you treating yourself like a lady or gentleman? And it's things like that that are actually actionable. Leave it better than you found it. That's the simple principle in my co-author's book, The Sink, and yet it's something that you can ask about every situation. Bring your best work. Is this your best work? That's one we use on our team. That one actually goes back to a story with a speech writer for a diplomat. And he kept sending it back saying, with the sticky note, is this your best work? He sent it back 8 times. The guy kept tweaking it. Finally, the guy sends it back and says, look, it can't get any better than this. I've done everything I can do to the speech. And the guy goes, great, I'll read this one. So it's simple things that really shape behavior versus just these uh, highfalutin. Boy, that's a real my dad word, right? Words that just don't have any value.
I agree. Those trite platitudes don't have the action. Um, where it's needed to really inspire action for you. Even like that Netflix philosophy, right? That we don't hire brilliant jerks
Yeah.
because they say the price of their teams is too great. Love it, right? It speaks very effectively to what their values are.
Yeah, and I mean, I guarantee you the first person that is a brilliant jerk that gets hired, the whole company is gonna raise up and say, "Whoa, wait a minute." There was a young guy that started at a company, and I think his dad was a client. It was a advertising company, and the CEO, the founder, actually had a policy that we don't put names of conference rooms, we put people's names on conference rooms. Like, if you've been here 20, 25 years, you get your name on a conference room. They also had, by the way, glass doors because people get nervous when a bunch of people walk in a room and shut the door and they can't see who's in there, what's going on. So there's full transparency. Well, this guy came to work and his last name was Coates and he hadn't been there very long. And they had just built their new space. And the other managers came to the owner and said, "Hey, this is not right. How did that guy get his name on a thing?" It turns out it was a coat closet. So, but in a what I call auto poetic culture, in a company of owners, what you find is that the team members start to police themselves or start to police each other. Just like on a great sports team, the coach doesn't have to say it in the locker room. If somebody's sandbagging or not, carrying their load, the other team members will get after them. Unfortunately, we don't have that. If you don't have a company of owners, then you got people going, NMJ, right? One of the worst things you want to hear, not my job.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's the ideal. But let's now move kind of to those companies that haven't built a culture yet, that are making some of these mistakes. What are some key management practices that everyone struggles with? And I'll start out with, when is the best time to fire someone or to let them go? Because I know that probably the majority of managers struggle with this because it's not something they really take much. They don't look forward to, right? They don't take much care of, and it's done in a haphazard manner.
Yeah. So it sounds a little flippant, but of course, I say in the book, the best time to fire somebody is the first time you think about it. I mean, if you're having that conversation in your brain, there's probably a reason for it because you've got other people on your team you would not even dream of firing, right? They're like a superstar. So you've got two ends of the problem. One, first of all, I recommend, it's been recommended before, but hire slow, fire fast. What we do is tends to be the opposite. We hire fast and then we fire slow, and it just drains everybody else. One of the worst things you can do is keep either poison on your team or keep underperformers because they're going to drag everything down. You ought to be managing them up or managing them out. What drives HR crazy is the what I call the "you're fine, you're fine, you're fired," which is I've given a person 5 out of 5 on the last 4 years of reviews. And then I'm finally had it. And I said, we need to fire this person. They're not performing well. Well, okay. You haven't been doing legitimate performance reviews if that indeed is the case. And it creates a legal nightmare when they can go to an attorney and say, "Hey, look at the kind of praise I've gotten." So we got to have honest conversations, and we need to realize we're not doing anybody a favor by keeping them in a position where they're not performing well. The other big mistake I see is we move them around. "Oh, okay, well, this isn't working out over here. Why don't we move you in here?" And it's just a shuffle. It's not with an intention of we think you might perform better in this other zone.
Well, and this really ties to culture as well, right? Because when you leave people in that you feel should not be part of your team, part of your organization, like what you said, it causes a cancer within the team, within the organization. You're really not living to your values. It can poison the waters for the rest of them.
People care about the people they're working around. And when they feel like there are people really not performing, not carrying their weight and just sort of mailing it in, it doesn't ignite high performers. Now your owners, your high performers are always going to perform,
Right.
but it's this subtle drag that starts to deflate them at some level because you feel like you're the only one pulling the cart.
Yep. Can agree more. So another hiring mistake slash management mistake is hiring people like you, which it's easier to do. A lot of people do it, but it doesn't breed diversity on many different levels.
Yeah. I
What
think
are some of those workarounds or solutions to get around from people doing it?
you want a highly diversified group of people at your company because different backgrounds, different perspectives bring different ideas. And what you don't want to be is an echo chamber of everybody marches to the same drum. So if you think about IBM back in the day when Gerstner got there to kind of break that up because they were going bankrupt, they had the penguin, what I call the little marching penguins. Everybody wore the same thing. They said the same things. Ford had a very similar thing when Alan Mulally came in there, only that was a real culture of fear, right? And when you create that, you create a scenario where everybody's superfluous except one person if we're all going to think and do the same things. So I think companies that really value getting multiple points of view and really creating that sense of all sorts of, we talked a lot today about diversity, but not just ethnic diversity or those which are very elements which are very important, but idea diversity, background diversity, things like that, because some of your best ideas may come from someone that is looking at it from a completely different angle.
Well, yeah, and you're right. Diversity occurs on many different levels. So we need to value that and not just value the one form of diversity. Before we end, since the Winter Olympics are going on, I know you use this example in the book as well about curling, and curling seems to be gaining popularity. I don't quite understand why, but it's on television more and more. People are getting into it. I have some family members that are avid viewers of it on the Winter Olympics and looking for other opportunities to try to engage in the sport even. So, but I love the metaphor that you use in the book on how this sport is tied to the right role that a manager should take. Can you elaborate on that one?
Yeah. And by the way, Charles, I love curling.
You do?
And maybe it's gaining popularity because of my book. We don't know.
It very well could be. You're right.
Whole new group of people to curling. But quick hit for people who don't know, someone throws the stone or slides the stone. They're trying to get it in a target. And then there's a sweeper out there that is either steering with it by sweeping in front of it to get it to curve left or curve right by, melting the snow very quickly, or they're flinging ice chips in it to try to get it to slow down so that we'll hit right there in the target. And for whatever reason, I think it's a blast to watch. And I don't even know the answer to my own question, Charles, which I ask in the book. And what my question is the manager the one taking charge of pushing the stone, or is the manager the one that is receiving that stone and following the directions of whoever's initiative this is and trying to help make that a reality, help they're in a support role. I really lean towards that. I can see situations for both, but I really think that if more managers stopped managing so much and started bringing out the best in their people and figuring out how to support them, they'd be surprised by the kind of effort that those people put forward.
Yeah. So ideally, the manager could be in occupying both those roles at different times or with different
Sure.
individuals or at different points of their development. So love
Yeah.
that metaphor. And I've had a new appreciation of the sport. So that just amplifies its impact for me as we relate it back to management. So as we reach the end of this episode, I always like to ask you for a call to action for our listeners of what they could do tomorrow, next week, that would build this ownership culture, whether they're in a senior executive role or a mid-level manager role.
Okay. Well, I'll give you a personal one, which is I want everybody that's watching this to create their own mantra, something that relates to their job that people would be able to see, witness, and evaluate. Are they doing this? Are they not doing this? So not some high mighty idea, but an actual kind of action, and start to implement that. And then obviously, if you're interested in this topic, one of the great things about my books is anybody can read them. By the way, it just this year hit Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller. So it's going strong. But I would also start with that first step on a more global company scale and really just walk around, observe, talk to people, and find out what the reality is of your culture, because that's going to give you a very clear picture of some of the changes that need to be made.
Oh, that's great. And that's a great book that you have, Company of Owners, Maximizing Employee Engagement. Are there other resources or books that you have read that would speak well to this topic? Our listeners always ask us, what are some other resources that your guests would recommend so that we can get started and go down the path a little bit farther?
Yeah, I think there's a book out called Extreme Ownership. We've got a lot of military people writing about this topic for some reason. I'm a voracious reader and always have like 8 books going on at a time, most of them either business or nonfiction related. And the resources just kind of abound. If you just search a company of owners, you're going to find a lot of stuff pop up that would be, my stuff and then other people's stuff as well. And I always say, Charles, readers are leaders. I came up with a new one that I think is original to me, which is learners are earners. And I just can't recommend enough. Take control of your own career, take control of what you're doing, truly act like an owner within the company, and you will make yourself indispensable to any company or organization.
That's great advice. And Darren, remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Super easy. If you spell my first name right, how my parents spelled it, Daren. My double R Darren's laugh at me. They say you only have one R, but Daren Martin, Martin.com. And my email I'll give as well. It's just Daren@DarenMartin.com. So yeah, love to hear from some of you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Daren Martin, for joining me today. And this concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found on both Apple and Spotify and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you, but what you do consistently that makes the difference.